A 3-month-old baby is dead. The question is why? Well, according to authorities in Kentucky, the two people who were supposed to be watching him and caring for him are why this little boy died from horrific injuries. And now with murder charges on the table, this case has taken a turn. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. My gosh, what a truly horrific and heartbreaking story this is. I mean, we're talking about the death of a little baby, a 3-month-old, Greyson Torres. And authorities say he was allegedly killed at the hands of the people who were supposed to be protecting him. This is a case that has, as you can imagine, shaken the Lexington, Kentucky community. An innocent child who should have been cherished and protected, now lost to alleged horrific abuse. So this incident unfolded quickly back on September 29th when officers were called to a local hospital after there was a report that a baby had been brought in with critical injuries. That baby, identified as little Greyson, was rushed into intensive care. But his injuries were just too severe. He reportedly suffered multiple head and torso injuries as well as internal trauma. And heartbreakingly, his injuries were so catastrophic that his family made that impossible decision to take him off life support. As the investigation progressed, authorities quickly narrowed in on Greyson's parents, Amancio Torres-Trevino and Kaela Walker, both 20 years old. And the two were initially charged with murder. According to an arrest citation, Torres-Trevino had been alone with Greyson when he was apparently injured. And according to the Murray Ledger and Times and the Lexington Herald-Leader, further investigation revealed that a witness had actually seen him allegedly abusing this baby multiple times before the child was hospitalized, meaning this was not an isolated incident, according to authorities. Now, when it came to Walker, the arrest citation revealed she had witnessed this abuse, but didn't intervene, didn't report it to authorities. That citation, which was reviewed by local media outlet WKYT, stated that Walker didn't report any signs of abuse to police or social workers, or even tried to stop it. Walker appeared in court back on October 21st, where she was seen weeping as a detective detailed the injuries that the medical examiner concluded led to this little child's death.
Retinal hemorrhaging, head bleeding behind the eyes, swelling to the brain, multiple brain bleeds, a fracture to the left arm, I believe a finger on the right hand, and to one of his legs.
Just absolutely horrible. And by the way, I should tell you, we were able to find Walker on the powerful background checker Truth Finder just by putting in her name and location. And we were able to see some things like possible relatives and addresses, but it appears she doesn't have any criminal history. And I will tell you what, Law&Crime, we partner with Truth Finder. We use it to get details on the people involved in our stories. But I'll tell you what, even if you don't work in true crime, this is an excellent resource to give you some peace of mind. It's one of the largest public record search services in the United States. And with a paid subscription service, you can get access to unlimited reports about almost anyone. So right now, if you're interested, you can get 50% off of your first month of confidential background reports. You just got to go to truthfinder.com/LC-Sidebar. Now, according to Walker's lawyer, she was also a victim of domestic abuse at the hands of the baby's father. So that'll be interesting to see what kind of defense that could potentially be. I'll get into that in a minute. What about Torres-Trevino? Well, he apparently waived his right to a preliminary hearing. We'll also discuss that as well. But then this case took a turn because the grand jury indicted both of these individuals on murder charges along with first-degree criminal abuse. Now, following this absolute tragedy, the family of Greyson created a GoFundMe campaign, writing, "We are completely blindsided and are still in shock this is even happening. We heard the words, no brain activity, and in an instant, all our lives were changed. How could one be so selfish to hurt an innocent baby? A selfish act of violence has cost a baby his life." And the family also honored Greyson's brief life, writing, "Little Greyson was a wonderful, beautiful baby boy who only lived a short 3.5 months here on Earth." Walker and Torres-Trevino both have arraignments scheduled for January 3rd, and I will tell you, if convicted of murder, which is our understanding to be a Class A felony in Kentucky, they face a maximum sentence of life in prison without parole. Now, as you can see, there are a lot of unanswered questions in this case, and I want to talk about it. So I actually had the opportunity to sit down with criminal defense attorney Sam Bassett. Let's check it out. Sam, thanks so much for coming on and coming here on Sidebar to talk about this case. I just want to get started by your general thoughts on this. I mean, especially the fact that at the time of Greyson's death, does it seem that it was likely, and maybe that it can be proven, that he was abused and that he was abused prior to what happened here?
Well, I think that the critical factor here is going to be the medical physical evidence, and along with any statements made by the couple, either the man or the woman. The other thing to consider is if you can prove through third-party witnesses that either of the people had a history of abuse or covering up abuse with the baby or being abusive with other children, that's a really tough hurdle to overcome for the defense.
Were you surprised that there's a murder charge here? Because how do you know exactly what happened? Whether maybe it's something like manslaughter, maybe it's something like negligent homicide. How do you say that this was a murder? Is it because of the age of the victim and the injuries that were sustained?
I think it's primarily the physical injuries, the medical reports on that, but also any statements made by the couple can corroborate a murder charge. And finally, the lesser charges that you mentioned, manslaughter or criminally negligent homicide, may come about as the defense develops its case and presents evidence at the trial. But for now, the prosecution's elected to charge murder.
And the fact that there was a charge of murder and there was also a charge of first-degree criminal abuse, why the two different charges?
Well, sometimes a jury may be hesitant to convict on intentionally causing the death of a child murder count. But it would be more obvious, I think, that the abuse count can be proven given the medical evidence. So a lot of times they charge death cases in this way in conjunction with what might be considered somewhat of a lesser charge to murder, just in case the jury is hesitant to go all the way with an intentional killing of another human.
I want to amplify that for a second. So this parent mother, Kaela Walker, if she is charged in connection with the death of the baby, even though perhaps the evidence does not suggest that she physically inflicted harm on Greyson, she could still be charged nonetheless with murder?
Yes, I'm not sure about the murder charge for her, but in criminal law, we typically don't prosecute people for omissions. However, there are certain circumstances under which we do prosecute omissions. In other words, a failure to act. In this case, she failed to protect the baby. Usually there's an age threshold for babies or for more elderly people who are under the care of a nursing professional or something like that. That's the theory, is that she had a duty at some point to protect the child from a known abuser.
By the way, if she can say, look, I was a victim too. I was a victim of domestic violence here. Does that affect her defense? Does that mitigate anything? Again, if she allegedly was being abused by the baby's father, would that help her in a defense at all?
That could help her with the defense in trying to convince the jury that she shouldn't be held culpable for the crimes committed by her partner. Also, it can really help her on the issue of sentencing if she is convicted of either charge. That's the type of evidence that a jury or a judge would consider in assessing sentence.
By the way, I have to say, every time I look at one of these alleged child abuse cases or clearly defined child abuse cases, I always look at the age of the victim. And when you see somebody, a child who's 3 months old, right, that is very different than a 6-year-old, a 5-year-old, a 4-year-old, because I've seen in those cases where a defendant would be like, well, I know there's a lot of injuries here, but this is a child that was on the jungle gym, pushed down by a friend, was running around. There's an aspect of this, right, how young this child was, that it can't be explained other than someone did something because they're in such a vulnerable, defenseless state, right?
That's absolutely correct. Obviously, if either or both are convicted of this charge, that will be something taken into account greatly, in my opinion, at the sentencing phase. This is a child that was defenseless, vulnerable. Who knows why what happened. But if proven, I think these folks face serious consequences.
Do you think one of the best defenses would be to blame the other?
I think there's no doubt there is a gender bias, in my opinion, in criminal justice most of the time. And I think there's no doubt that the woman's defense will blame the male for the actions and use what you termed earlier as an abuse rationale for her defense. So yes, there's going to be finger pointing, no doubt, unless they just refuse to do that. And then they both go down together, theoretically, if they don't.
I just had a legal question for you. The reporting indicated that Torres-Trevino actually waived a preliminary hearing, and then it moved forward to a grand jury, and there was ultimately an indictment. Why does someone waive a preliminary hearing?
Well, a preliminary hearing is typically just a hearing where the judge reads the charge to the defendant, asks him how he pleads, or just notifies him of the charge and his bond amount. An attorney with experience almost always waives that hearing because there's really nothing to it. There's no defense, there's no argument to be made. It's just kind of a notification hearing.
And it's kind of the early stages of just seeing a little bit of strategy here. But now I go into this other aspect. You mentioned it's going to come down to the medical findings. It'll come down to the medical experts here. How does a defense attorney strike at that evidence? How do you challenge that evidence presented by the prosecution, the medical findings, the trauma, the reports of abuse, the medical examiner's report? How do you challenge those kind of things?
You have to hire your own expert. Usually a pediatric orthopedist, pediatric surgeon, or somebody with expertise in the medical care and treatment of young children and treating trauma in young children. Obviously, that subset of experts is going to be fairly small. One of the problems you run into sometimes as a defense attorney is getting one of those physicians to agree to be an expert in a case such as this. Because doctors who practice in this area obviously have an ideological commitment to the treatment of young children. And some doctors just refuse to help the defense in these kinds of cases. But there are experts that you need to hire as a defense attorney to help you not only understand what the evidence is, but to challenge it.
Given what they might be facing if they're convicted, would you advise them to take a plea deal in this case? And I'm not even sure what a plea deal might look like.
Yeah, I mean, as a defense attorney in this type of case, you're really working uphill from the beginning. But the first thing you have to do is evaluate the evidence and determine if there's any weaknesses in the state's case. Is there any way we can defend this? What about the medical evidence? Can we challenge that? It's a client-driven prerogative, too, how to plead. That's the one decision, one of a few decisions that only the client can make. But your job as a defense attorney first is to evaluate the case. How strong is the case against the defendant? Is there any weakness? And what are those weaknesses? Can you exploit them? And then once you determine if there are weaknesses, then you negotiate with the prosecution. If there are no apparent weaknesses, often we get prosecutors who say there's no plea bargain offered here. We're going to trial. And this could be one of those cases given the publicity.
Let me ask you this. What role does the mental state, the personal history of the parents play in either A, a legal defense, or B, sentencing?
I think, as I said before, sometimes those two, the legal defense and sentencing strategy, can be parallel. Obviously, you look into the background of your client. You try to determine, were they, as children, abused? Did they come from an abusive background? Did they have a very difficult upbringing? People who don't have the advantages of most of us are often portrayed in court and to judges and juries as not being as culpable or as seriously punished as someone who has privileges in life and has opportunities and doesn't take them. So yes, you obviously are going to look into the background of each defendant and determine if there's anything in their background that engenders any sort of sympathy or mitigation in the evaluation of what should happen to them.
Really, really distressing case, one that I see way too often, but we will continue to see what happens. Sam Bassett, thanks so much for taking the time. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, everybody, that's all we have for you right now here on Sidebar. Thank you so much for joining us. And as always, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Jesse Weber. I'll speak to you next time.